welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 14 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the beginning of the end of the world. And before we even get started, we have a special guest with us today. We have Justin Wiggins, the author of Surprised by Agape.
Hello, Dan and Phil. My name is Justin Wiggins, and author of Surprised by Agape, and it is an absolute honor to be on your podcast.
We're thrilled to have you here, man. This has been a long time in the making.
Justin, we're so excited to have you here. I've been following you, been a big fan of you for a while now, and just read your book recently and really enjoyed it. And this is going to be a great time we have discussing Narnia, learning more about the work that you're up to. And I think for listeners who are familiar with you, they'll be really excited to hear you here on the show. And for listeners who don't know you yet, I think we'll be very happy to have learned more about you by the time this episode ends.
Thank you very much for having me again on your show. It was an honor to meet you both back in November at the C.S. Lewis Symposium. And I appreciate what you guys do through your podcast, through promoting C.S. Lewis's writings.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a fun journey so far. Glad to have you a part of it.
Yes, indeed.
So, Justin, before we jump into chapter 14 here, we wanted to ask you a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests, and then we have some special questions for you as an author. So the first one I want to ask you is, can you just tell us what your relationship is with the Chronicles of Narnia? Maybe how did you encounter them, and what's that relationship look like now?
Oh, yes, indeed. So years ago, when I was just starting community college and was still an agnostic, actually, I learned about C.S. Lewis's writings through John Foreman, the lead singer of Switchfoot. And at that point in my life, I had started listening to Switchfoot's music, and I loved how they didn't have a sacred or secular either or, and they made music for people of all worldviews. And there was actually a YouTube video I saw of John Foreman where he was playing an acoustic version of This Is Home that he wrote for the Prince Caspian film, and he referenced C.S. Lewis and talked about this yearning and longing that we have for the presence of God and for our true home in heaven in the here and now. And it was interesting to me. And so I really admired him as a thinker, and he spoke so highly of Lewis. And I honestly had no idea who Lewis was. And I didn't grow up reading the books, the Chronicles of Narnia. I wasn't familiar with anything he had written. There were a couple of references here and there that people would make to him, but it didn't really stand out to me. And so I ended up purchasing the all 7-book and volume set from a Barnes & Noble in Greenville, North Carolina. And my first spiritual experience, that I liken it to Lewis's experience of when he read George MacDonald's Fantast when he was a young atheist, was reading the creation story in The Magician's Nephew. And I remember the very day and the very moment and the very hour. And in that moment, I finally understood why Jesus told parables in the first century to the poor and the freaks and the broken and the outcast and anyone that came to him. And he told these parables to communicate things about justice and faith and hope and love. And I also understood in that moment why myth and storytelling is important to us. And it was just amazing to read this creation story in this fairy tale written for people of all ages. And it helped me to understand all of these things. And I was filled with that overwhelming yearning and longing, the Sehnsucht, that beautiful German word that Lewis called joy. And so that was a very powerful experience for me. And after I read the Narnia series, I got a copy of Mere Christianity. And of course, I had to take my time because I hadn't read any theological works before. And the way Lewis brought together reason, the limits of philosophical argument, and reason itself and our finite human understanding and imagination and one's own personality, and faith as a virtue and how it all comes together by grace was just so revolutionary to me. And so I had a very gradual conversion after I read Mere Christianity, but it really all started with the Chronicles of Narnia, and I still have that one in volume set and just actually finished rereading it. And so it brought back those very good memories. And as you both know, so many people have had these stories read to them as children. Some friends have read these stories to their children, and they are timeless, transcendent works of great literature.
Yeah, that is such a glowing recommendation for the Chronicles of Narnia as an entry point into the other great stuff that C.S. Lewis has, and it looks like that's exactly what happened for you.
Yes, indeed. Before I read the Chronicles of Narnia, I actually had a hard time sitting still. I would say I had the attention span of a goldfish. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but those books taught me how to read. They taught me how to pay attention to the the choice of words, the ideas that a writer is communicating, and the power of again story and narrative.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's really cool, Justin. Thanks for sharing that. I think it's such a great story of why these books are so important. And I love it because I think a lot of our listeners, not all, but I think quite a few are like Phil and I who grew up with these books and like, don't really remember a time without them. And even to an extent where, speaking for Phil, Phil often talks about how he really doesn't remember them because he read them so long ago, those first couple ones that he actually has read.
Oh yeah.
And it's so cool to hear someone who encountered them not throughout their entire childhood. And I love just kind of the diversity of experiences that all of us bring to these books, and yet we all are still so impacted by them.
Right.
So, Justin, do you have a favorite of those 7? I assume you have to. Most people do.
Oh yes. My favorite by far would have to be the magician's nephew, and the reason being is because my first experience of the Zenzuk, that joy, the yearning and longing that John Foreman referenced, was what happened to me when I read that creation story when Aslan is singing Narnia into being. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the last book that Lewis wrote in the series.
Well, I think it was the second to last one that. Or wait, you might be right. I think he might have written it after the last battle. But Phil and I always tout that we are Narnia novices. So if we're wrong, I'm sure someone will let us know.
Oh yes, that's certainly my favorite.
Well, Justin, we have a couple other questions for you as an author. So you have written a book called Surprised by Agape. And if listeners aren't familiar with that book, what would you want them to know about it?
So, Surprised by Agape is part memoir in the context of I tried to capture my conversion from agnosticism to Christianity, and I wanted to write it in a way for people of all worldviews to be able to read and resonate with in the context of their own experience. Another aspect of it is how, after years after my conversion, I made it through a dark night of the soul, and how in that the pain and the suffering and the struggle, faith didn't end up becoming a delusion but a virtue, and how the agape love of Christ sustained me through that, and how out of that came so much joy and beauty and growth and community. And another aspect of it is the theme of agape love in the writings of C.S. Lewis, the influence of George MacDonald on Lewis's writings, the and also how powerful and universal music, literature, and art is, and how for me that really started with the music of John Foreman and the guys in Switchfoot.
Well, that's awesome, and you kind of answered my next question too, which is wonderful. Well, I was going to ask, what was the impetus for writing this book? But you've kind of shared some of that. Anything else you want to add to that, though, about kind of the why behind this book?
So I wanted to write a book about why I embraced faith and why I believe faith is a virtue rather than a delusion. As you know, our postmodern world is very uh, it's many people are searching, many people are asking questions, and oftentimes faith can be downplayed as wishful thinking or delusion or something like that, especially with, you got writers like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris out there who, as you both probably know, embarrass many very serious atheists. They've been referred to as it's pop atheism, that sort of thing. Um, but I, I wanted to write this and to describe why I embraced faith in Christ and what led up to that. But also, I wanted to write it in a way, again, if someone that has a very different worldview could be able to pick it up and read it and appreciate it, even if they disagree with me philosophically. And I also wanted to write a book, an expression of gratitude to Christ for how amazing his agape love is and how he brought me out of the dark night of the soul and brought to my life healing and hope, and also to express gratitude to C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald, the band Switchfoot, and all the amazing community of people that I have in my life.
That's fantastic. What I really appreciate about this is George MacDonald has been a big influence in my life as well, and it's fun to see
Oh,
how he influenced C.S. Lewis, and then
and
C.S. Lewis has influenced you, and now you're telling a story that I have a very good feeling will influence someone else, and the story just continues.
indeed, thank you. Yes, it's an amazing thing how you can um, when you see like you were talking about how George MacDonald's influenced your life and how he influenced Lewis and Tolkien, and he also influenced G.K. Chesterton and Joy Davidman, and I believe Owen Barfield, one of the other Inklings, read his work and really enjoyed it, as well as Charles Williams. So it's incredible how through telling our stories, whether it be in the form of work of fantasy, a fairy tale, a novel, or memoir, or a song, or what you guys do on your podcast. It's incredible and a reminder that the great artist is telling the story of our lives, and we're all connected, and we all are equal in his eyes, and that's a really amazing.
Yeah, it really is amazing. Well, two more questions for you, Justin. Obviously, being an author can open a lot of doors, and I think our listeners, and we would as well, would love to hear maybe about a moment or an experience that you've been able to have because you've written this book. And the answer cannot be meeting Phil and I. I know that probably is the top of your list, that because you've written the book, we're now friends. But other than meeting us, what has been one of your favorite experiences you've been able to have because of this book?
Wow, that is a very good question. I would One that I've experienced is recently I did a book signing at the Barnes and Noble that I work at in Asheville, and having the community that came out from Monterey College, from my church Redeemer Anglican, some friends from Black Mountain, and having their support and um, being there, it was an absolute honor. And it reminded me of how years ago, when I was in the darkest place in my life and I didn't think there was any hope, and I was struggling with, is my faith a delusion? Is it a virtue? Is God good? How can I be going through all of this? And I honestly didn't know if I was going to make it. So and it was either February the 7th or February the 8th. I can't remember exactly. But that day was very important for me because it allowed me to look back on that really painful and traumatic time and to see how out of that, if I had never gone through that pain and suffering, I never would have been able to go to Monterey College and never would have been able to go to Oxford, England. That was a life changing trip. I had always wanted to go and never thought I would have the opportunity, but I did. And I was so thankful to be able to get to experience that. I never would have moved to the mountains of North Carolina. I would have never met you guys at the C.S. Lewis Symposium, and Surprised by Agape never would have happened. So I thought about all of those things on that day of the book signing, and it just reminded me of how incredible and amazing the agape love of Christ is, and I'm immensely thankful for that love, which gives me hope every day that I get to live.
Wow, that is so fun to hear. It sounds like such a dark time. Christ really worked through that, and you're very aware of all the blessings that came afterwards.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Well, we have one final question for you, Justin. What are some of your future plans as an author?
So I've um, recently finished a piece for the C.S. Lewis Zenzook Journal. That was an essay review of the Horse and His Boy play that was performed in Taylor, South Carolina through the Logos Theater. Nicole and Noah Stratton are the owners, and that was a wonderful time. And
Mm-hmm.
Doug Gresham came for the event. And Crystal Hurd, who is a good friend and a friend of you guys as well, who will be
Yeah.
on your show, really seemed brilliant individual. And I first met her in 2015 at the Inklings retreat here in Montreat, and she asked if I would write the piece for the Zanzuk Journal, and I said absolutely. So that was something that was an honor to be a part of. In regard to future ideas for different works, I have had an idea involving a mythical story, perhaps set in its own world. I haven't tried my hand at fiction much, but it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. Um, so that's just been one idea, and I'll continue to write pieces for Mr. Grant Hudson of Clarendon House Publications, who publishes quite an eclectic variety of literature. So that's been one idea that I have had in regard to other particular ones. It'll be interesting to see what happens, because I continue to write every day, and read favorite writers and read other writers that friends recommend. And it's interesting how inspiration happens. Some books can take, goodness, Surprised by Agape took about 10 years, and um, so perhaps something will come together in the next few years, or maybe in a year. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that.
I think you're still ahead of schedule compared to Tolkien, though, right?
Yes.
I think he was
That's
at
very true.
13
I mean,
for.
even Lewis started writing Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He started in the late 30s, right? And it didn't get published till 1950. So who knows what's ahead for you? That's exciting, Justin. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, now that we know you better, I think it's time for all three of us to dive into Chapter 14 of The Dawn Treader.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, last episode, we left off Chapter 13. The last three lords were found on this island. They were asleep. It was very odd, and we were left with more questions than answers. And some of those questions are about to get answered. Phil, it is an even chapter. Would you like to take it away with your summary?
I would love to. Caspian, Reepicheep, and the children meet an old man and watch as he and his daughter sing a song while clouds lift away above them and the sun rises above the world. Then birds descend from the sky in massive numbers and consume the entire feast at the table before them. After they leave, the old man introduces himself as Ramandu and reveals that he is a retired star, and explains that in order to lift the enchantment on the three lords, the crew will need to journey even further east, then return with one less crew member, who may never return again. Caspian gives a speech that makes almost everyone in the crew want to be a part of the group to partake on that journey. Before they leave, Caspian tells Ramadu's daughter that he hopes to speak with her again after breaking the enchantments. She smiles, and the crew sets sail once more.
Very well done, Phil.
Great reading.
So what were some of the things that stood out to y'all before we do our deep dive into this chapter? Any big standouts here?
We'll get to this when we read certain sections, but just the way some of this stuff is described was really powerful. It seems like they're getting further and further away from the reality that we know. So in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there was a forest, there were trees, it was snowing all the time, but even even then we still kind of knew what things would look like. This seems to be very different than the world that we experience every day.
Indeed, and as Phil was saying, I should like to add the excitement that one gets when you read, you continue to read chapter after chapter from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and especially this one, you're getting closer to them, getting closer to Aslan's country.
Yeah, and there's this weird thing in this chapter, or in this whole book in general, that makes it quite different from the rest of the Narnia Chronicles, in that it almost kind of becomes more ethereal exponentially. It's not like a little building block each chapter. It's we hit this final island here, and it really just ramps up to 10 at this point. It feels otherworldly. It almost feels like it's out of control in a very good way. And obviously we can't move into chapter 15 or 16, but it's only going to get more ethereal. And it in this very odd way, it doesn't take me out of the story. Instead, it makes me more and more enveloped by the story. The way that Lewis is writing it so delicately. This was one of the hardest times for me to put the book down after chapter 14. I was like, I cannot go further. Even though I know what happens, I wanted to keep reading. I'm sure this was difficult for you, Phil.
Oh, you have no idea. This was also just another example of when someone writes truly well, and that can include writing things that are very interesting to read. This is a great example because I started reading. I had a little bit of trouble focusing for about a paragraph, and then I was completely sucked in. I'm just flying through the chapter. It's just very well written.
Well, let's go ahead and start working through this a little bit at a time. The chapter begins with a door opening, that door from last chapter, and out comes an old man who we learn later is named Ramandu. A very odd thing begins to happen. This cold kind of song, an early morning kind of song, according to Lucy, begins to kind of be sung out throughout the entire island. And the description that Lewis gives here is very unique as far as the description we've gotten so far of other islands and other odd occurrences in this story so far. Ramandu comes out, he sings with his daughter, and even Edmund says that this is one of the most beautiful things of the entire trip. The sun comes up, and here's what Edmund says. Though lots of things happen on that trip which sound more exciting, that moment was really the most exciting. Lewis goes on to write, for now they knew they had truly come to the beginning of the end of the world. What do y'all make of this sunrise here?
For myself, it's Lewis writing about the Zenzuk and perhaps a personal experience that allowed him to be able to write this as the landscape of Ireland from when he was a young lad. As you both know, much of the land, I suppose all of the landscape of Narnia is influenced by the landscape of Ireland where he grew up. So, and as you know, his prose is just incredible. And I'm perhaps thinking that he might be incorporating a very personal experience he saw of the sunrise there in Ireland, or perhaps later in his life when he went on holiday with Warnie back to their native home.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's cool that it was so influenced by that.
So as the sun is rising, we get the arrival of these white birds who start picking off the food. They eat the things that can be eaten, and they take away, the bones and the shells, the things that cannot be eaten. And I was reading The Keys to the Chronicles, which is written by Marvin Hinton, who we've mentioned a couple of times on the show, and he wrote this, which I found very interesting. When the sun rises over Aslan's table, symbolizing Christ's presence, thousands of large birds come to cover everything. They have marked similarities to traditional descriptions of angels, being large, white, flying, singing creatures that speak in a language which no one knew. And he's quoting Lewis right there. Did y'all make any connections to some kind of manifestation of Aslan here through the sun here at Aslan's table? And then second, what do y'all think about this idea of the birds being angels, which Hinton mentions here?
Well, as per usual, a lot of the bird stuff was over my head.
I certainly see the bird symbolizing them getting closer to Aslan, his presence being nearer, and their experience of all of these birds is a theophany, as when someone is in scripture, when, for example, Mary's husband Joseph is visited by the angel. He's
Hmm.
having a theophany and is quite he's in awe and just he marveled at what happened. And so that's a really great parallel that the writer made between the what the birds symbolize, and how he correlates that to angels appearing to human beings and speaking in a language that we can't understand, but could perhaps experience the beauty of.
Hmm.
And one of the other things that Hinton mentions very briefly is this idea of the manifestation, or Christ's manifestation at the table here, well, through Aslan in this proposal. In last chapter, we talked about this idea of the table potentially being a Eucharist of some sort here in Narnia. Have you ever thought about that, Justin? Has that ever come up? We even couldn't decide ourselves how exactly we felt about that. There's some professors that feel very much like this is supposed to be Narnia's version of communion, and others who are not so sure. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Indeed, I would say so. As you know, Lewis, although he was described himself as a mere Christian, was very Anglican, or some writers have said Anglo Catholic, and he certainly had a very mystical view of the sacraments as something given by God, and through the bread and the wine, we experience spiritual nourishment in a
Mm-hmm.
way that you can't describe into logic. So I would certainly say that that particular part from this Narnia story is very sacramental.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Justin. Well, let's keep moving on here. These birds show up, they're taking everything away, and then this very odd thing happens. A bird comes down and lays a little fruit in the mouth of the old man. Very interesting thing,
Oh
right?
yes, yes.
If I had a nickel.
For every time birds put food in your mouth.
I love how the food is described. It's glowing very bright like a coal.
Yeah, isn't that so odd? Do you think it tastes good?
No.
It would be rather unsettling if a bird did come and put some food in your mouth. That would be rather amusing and very unsettling.
Right. And knowing how birds feed their young, I don't think it would be very appetizing.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that one. So, Phil, what happens next?
Well, next, as soon as the old man acknowledges them and welcomes them,
After he gets his breakfast.
right after he's eaten his flaming hot coal, Caspian has a question. He wants to break this enchantment, and I think there's a little extra motivation for Caspian. He wants the adventure, sure, but I think he's also, as we get another hint of at the end of the chapter, I think he's interested in if there are any rewards.
You talking about his crush that's there on the island?
Yes.
Or, which,
Yeah.
let's talk about this for a second. I have to be honest that I'm a little frustrated that we don't get a name for Ramadu's daughter here. There's very few.
Susan.
Yeah, no. There's so few female characters here in this book. It's kind of a bummer here that that she's not really named and not given much of a personality other than her relationship to both her father and then Caspian here. I think that's something that's a little frustrating for me that we
Yeah.
don't get to know more about her, and we don't really have it. And maybe that'll change in the next couple of chapters, but so far she doesn't really exist outside of her relationship with these other two characters.
Yeah. So in his line of questioning, Caspian wants to know if this guy even knows enough information about what's further east. And he says that he knows a lot because he's seen it from a distance. And then it starts to be revealed that he used to be a star. And this is the part I wanted to read. So he has just said that he was a star, and he ceased long before any of them knew this world. and all the constellations have changed. And Edmund says, "Golly, he's a retired star." And Lucy asked, "Aren't you a star any longer?" "I am a star at rest, my daughter," answered Ramadou. "When I set for the last time, decrepit and old beyond all that you can reckon, I was carried to this island. I'm not so old now that I was then. Every morning a bird brings me a fireberry from the valleys in the sun, and each fireberry takes away a little of my age. When I have become as young as the child that was born yesterday, then I shall take my rising again, for we are at earth's eastern rim, and once more tread the great dance."
Really interesting here. One of my biggest takeaways here is I'm now going to use this vocabulary of being at rest. When I retire one day, people are like, "Are you retired?" I'm like, no, I'm just at rest." Right? That's the way to say it from now on.
Or anytime Anna asks you to do the dishes.
So I am at rest.
I am at rest.
I do like that expression, though. So interesting here. This is pretty new territory for us as Narnia readers. This idea of this son or a son being a person, and then through his breakfast of fireberries from the valleys of the sun, getting younger and younger, becoming a baby, and then going back to being a son once more. This kind of quasi reincarnation thing here. So interesting.
With a little bit of Benjamin Button mixed in. Just for
Exactly,
good measure.
that's true. It's such a unique thing to happen. I love the imagination of Lewis here. But it gives us so many more questions, which Lewis really isn't going to answer. And I do like that in a sense.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yes, he leaves it open to interpretation.
Sure does. This happened earlier too, when Lewis says, "I can't really tell you what the song was because no one wrote it down." But because he chose that moment to not describe it, it leaves so much to the imagination, and it was a really key point for him to do that.
Yes, indeed.
So, Justin, did you want to read that next piece of the text here?
Indeed. So the particular part which really stood out to me is when Eustace says to Ramadou, "In our world," said Eustace, "a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of."
What stands out to you about that, Justin?
The contrast of Eustace's materialistic or naturalistic view, or I suppose you could say scientific empirical view of a star just being a ball of flaming gas, and Lewis is giving his view of medieval cosmology, which he wrote very movingly about in The Discarded Image. So right here you have him writing about the heavens as part of the great dance, and that although you can to some degree explain in a scientific empirical way what a star is made of, still scientific empiricism is itself finite human understanding, and the stars in the heavens reflect the glory and love and beauty of God. And you have this very wise retired star, as Phil said, conveying wisdom to the young Eustace's ignorant assumption about the heavens. So I like that worldview contrast, and how, again, Lewis is weaving in elements from The Discarded Image.
Yeah, it's neat how so many of his works weave together in this way. He explores the same idea, but from completely different angles.
Indeed.
And we have to imagine that Lewis is really enjoying writing this because, like you mentioned, Justin, he is really letting loose with his medieval cosmology here. And think about it. It's so right that it's Eustace that makes this comment. I mean, go back to chapter 1. He likes books if they're books of information. Right? It's this very analytical versus maybe we might want to call it synthetic thinking. Right? Where what Eustace likes to do is deconstruct ideas in a very modernist. Lewis isn't writing at the time of postmodernism. So let's go back to modernist, some of those ideals and worldview, and deconstructing things in a way to kind of get to know them better. Where and the medievals would have differed from a modernist viewpoint because instead they look at the whole, right? They look at the whole of something and they find its meaning within that rather than taking it apart. And not that taking things apart or deconstructing things is inherently bad or wrong. It's not. But the rebuke that we get here from Ramadou is that he's not seeing the full picture when he does that. If all he's looking at are these deconstructed pieces of whether it is the sun or just anything else in the world, he's missing out on a much larger picture that in some ways, and we think about this even outside of this own text, the medievals understood better than we do as 21st century readers.
Oh, yes.
Which is ironic because often we think about the medievals as people who just knew nothing, and they were so silly in all of their ideas about the way the world worked. And they did have lots of silly ideas, but they did have a worldview that I think has various parts of it that we're lacking as 21st century thinkers.
Indeed. Very good point. Very good point.
And then it's in this same conversation that it is revealed, Phil, I don't know if this was a surprising thing to you, that Koryakin, one of the characters we've already met, we met him on the Duffer's Island, he is a star, or was a star, and he's in trouble.
Yeah, so when I read this, I thought, oh, this is what Daniel was asking about several episodes ago.
Uh-huh.
And it turns out he was a little bit in trouble.
What do y'all think he did? I know we're not going to find out, and we're not supposed to ask, and it's not for us to know, but what kind of fault can a star commit? Right? That's what Caspian wants to know, too. What do you guys think he did wrong?
Are you asking what The Fault in Our Stars is?
The John Green reference.
Yes.
That's right. You tried to sneak it in there. I had to call it out.
I wasn't trying. I wasn't even thinking about that. But, I mean, what could he do? What could he have done? He just tried to shine too brightly?
Yeah. Or maybe he didn't shine brightly enough. We don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps some kind of perhaps the sin of pride. That's one idea that comes to my mind.
Oh, I like that a lot.
What can we extrapolate from what we know about him with I don't even know the right word anymore. Duffel puds?
Those things. Yeah, the duffel puds is correct.
Duffel puds.
And I think one of the things, it would make sense. You got this idea of pride, Justin. I really like that. And kind of add on to that, maybe he kind of shied away from some of his responsibilities. We see that he's very impatient with the duffel puds. I don't blame him, but he is quite impatient with them, and he gets frustrated very easily. And we had a listener who just wrote in an episode or two ago talking about the way that we are as humans kind of like the duffel puds, whereas it's God who is much more like this, or what we should want Koryakin to be. Koryakin is not Aslan, he's not God in this scenario, and so he does get impatient, but God is more than patient with us, even when we continually do things that are hurting us, or we think we're doing things that are better, but no, you know, doing the dishes before you've even eaten is actually a terrible idea, and so maybe that is this idea that Koryakin just was too prideful in his own work because he saw himself being better than the duffel puds. I mean, or maybe whatever he was, not the duffel puds in this scenario, but being whatever he was in charge of, whatever he was the son of, the star of.
I can imagine him getting in trouble for inaction. I don't know what your roles and responsibility are as a star, but it seems like he let the duffel puds be invisible for a long time. But I guess he was kind of waiting he knew that Lucy would show up. He just didn't know when. But it seems like he doesn't try super hard at his job, even then.
And yeah, I agree with you, Phil. I think perhaps he got quite lazy and was not living up to who he was fully created to be.
Yeah.
I do like the way that it's written here, where Ramadou says, "It was not quite as a rest that he was set to govern the Duffers. You might call it punishment." And I just like the idea that just being with the Duffers is some kind of punishment.
I felt like I was being punished when I had to read about them.
I thought you liked them. I thought it was just me that didn't like them.
I started to get really annoyed when they kept agreeing with everything.
Justin, do you have an opinion on the Duffers? Are you a fan? Are you not a fan?
They are. I laughed when I read that chapter. They're a very amusing creatures, and I love their remarks. And yeah, so that's That's one um, idea that comes to
Yeah.
my mind in regard to the duffel puds.
So we learn next that in order for this enchantment to be broken, the Dawn Treader has to sail eastward and leave someone on their crew there. And this is great news for Reepicheep because this is all he's ever wanted to do. This is the best news
Yeah.
we could have given him. And
Yes.
but for Caspian, he's got a pretty tough decision to make. Caspian is honest with Ramadou that his men are tired. They have been on this journey for a long time. Their goal was to find the seven lords, and they have done that now. And he shows an incredible amount of maturity here as he thinks through the next steps for the Dawn Treader. As this group of people are talking, he realizes that he has a little bit of a plan that he can put in place here. And so what's going on, Phil?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite leadership takeaways from this book. Everyone was not everyone, but a lot of people were volunteering to be a part of the crew to journey even further east into the unknown. But they were doing it almost as an act of charity. They thought, hey, like we can help you out. Like we'll do it if you really, really need us to. And Caspian completely flips the script on them. And he says, I think you guys misunderstand. This is not just we're not begging you to come along with us. This is an incredible opportunity, but we can't take everyone. There can only be a select few that get to go. It's going to be the best of the best. So we're going to have a little meeting here, and I'm going to have this group of people pick their team, and then we're going to go. And the results are staggering.
And I like what Phil said because it shows how Caspian is showing himself to be a very good king who has a high spirit of adventure and who's conveying in a very stern but loving way towards these individuals what it means to be part of this adventure and gives the reasoning behind it in the first place.
Right. And it's such a great leadership moment because he could have just said, like, you have to do this. And there would have been this attitude of, partway through, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Our leadership isn't that great. But now, because of the way he presented it, everyone starts competing and they want to be the best. And they start kind of trying to get close to the people who are going to choose the team. And by the end of the afternoon, everybody except for one person is really ready to go. And they even convince that person for a little bit, but he ends up staying.
Those are such great ideas. And as I was reading some of Brown's thoughts on this chapter, he makes a great connection between Henry V, the play by Shakespeare, and Caspian, which I had not picked up on this at all. I am familiar with Henry V, obviously, but never thought about his relationship to Caspian. So for people who aren't familiar, there's a really famous speech in Henry V right before the Battle of Agincourt which comes on St. Crispin's Day. Henry gives a big speech to all of the English as they're about to go fight the French. And there's a connection that Brown makes between that speech and what Caspian does here. So let me read a little bit from Inside the Voyage of the Dawn Treader by Brown. Both Henry and Caspian employ their best rhetorical skills, but in the end, each gives his men a free choice. Ramadou tells Caspian that his men must know where they go and why, and that it would be no use sailing with men unwilling or men deceived. It is the mark of good kings and queens of Narnia to govern by consent and a commitment to the truth, just as it is the mark of the evil rulers, tyrants such as the White Witch, Miraz, and Gumpus, to govern by force and deception. Miraz used coercion to send the seven lords into exile. Caspian, if he is to undo his uncle's wrong, cannot use the same means no matter how noble his ends.
Ooh, that is so good.
That is a very moving passage. I'd never realized that correlation between Shakespeare's play and this part from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Wow.
And I loved how you pointed out the connection between how the lords got there in the first place and how Caspian is close to... He's in a situation where he could almost repeat the same mistake by forcing them to go even further. Mm-hmm. Forcing the crew, not the seven lords.
So then there's about 30 minutes where the crew has to go off and decide what happens, and Caspian's plan works about as well as it could. and they're all fighting. Lewis even says that, as they would call it in his school, there's some sucking up that is done here to I think it's Drinian, that the sailors are really trying to get on his good side. And there's 3 men who really don't want to go, and they're trying to rein other people in and convince them, no, you should stay with us too. And then it's all down to one, and I'm going to read this paragraph here near the end of the chapter. At the end of the half hour, they all came trooping back to Aslan's table and stood at one end, while Drinian and Rents went and sat down with Caspian and made their report. And Caspian accepted all the men but the one who had changed his mind at the last moment. His name was Pittencream, and he stayed on the island of the Star all the time the others were away looking for the world's end, and he very much wished he had gone with them. He wasn't the sort of man who could enjoy talking to Ramandu or Ramandu's daughter, nor they to him, and it rained a good deal. And though there was a wonderful feast on the table every night, he didn't very much enjoy it. He said it gave him the creeps sitting there alone, and in the rain as likely as not, with those 4 lords asleep at the end of the table. And when the others returned, he felt so out of things that he deserted on the voyage home at the Lone Islands and went and lived in Calormen, where he told wonderful stories about his adventures at the end of the world, until at last he came to believe them himself. So you may say, in a sense, that he lived happily ever after, but he could never bear mice. Isn't that why? There's nothing to do but laugh, because it's such great storytelling there.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. Yes, indeed.
I think that is a fear for a lot of people, is missing out. Not the usual fear of missing out, but this is, he made a choice to not go, and everybody else went. And he really regretted it for the rest of his life. And I think the only reason he was, quote, happily ever after, the only reason he was happy after that was because he was lying about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, he lied so much he convinced himself that he had actually gone on these adventures. You could see that it was in his heart's desire, but he couldn't get over the fear or the apprehension.
Yeah. That happiness that he experiences at the end is not a happiness that is true. Like you mentioned, Phil, it's a happiness that is deceitful. Like, he's happy, but he's had to force himself to be this way because of his poor choices. And it's such a selfish decision, too, because Caspian even says that every man that comes with us shall bequeath the title of Dawn Treader to all his descendants. And, he goes on, he mentions that they're going to have gold or land enough to make him rich all of his life. And this isn't just a one-person thing. This is setting up descendants and a generation and another generation to benefit from the brave decision that these sailors make here. And yet, Pittencream decides what's in his best interest is to not follow them, even if it means his children and his children's children will be punished. Not punished, but will not benefit from this. It's such a selfish thing here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So after, he's left behind, the Dawn Treader sets sail again for the last time here. And they head off to, the end of the world. Any final thoughts as we wrap this chapter up?
There's this part right at the end where Caspian speaks to Ramandu's daughter. And he says, "Lady, I hope to speak with you again when I have broken the enchantments." And Ramandu's daughter looked at him and smiled. And I love how this makes turning the page to the next chapter so much more likely, because we have a hint of what's left to come. They're not just going. There's this hope that they'll go and come back. And there might be a hint of something between the two of them. And it's really exciting.
You like a good romance, don't you, Phil?
I do.
Oh,
That's fine.
yeah,
You go for it. Yeah.
As long as it was actually written in the book.
So you're not a fan of Susan and Caspian, is what you're telling us.
It just it didn't make a ton of sense.
Well, it does it if I know
it makes a ton of sense why they did it.
I know exactly. That's what I mean.
It doesn't make sense in the story.
It doesn't make sense in the story exactly. Any other thoughts, Justin?
I agree with Phil. I really like the way that Lewis ended the chapter. And one other particular thought is that the very title of the book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and this journey towards the end of the world reminded me, and I wonder if this was an influence on Lewis's writing this, is William Morris's The Well at the World's End. He wrote it in 2 volumes, and I read the first volume and never got around to reading the second one, but it reminded me of that particular work, and I wonder if that had influenced Lewis in writing this, and also his Irish childhood, all the Celtic myths about journeys towards the end of the world. No doubt that certainly had an influence on his imagination when he was writing this. So perhaps this is the most Irish of all the Narnia stories.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I really like that. Well, that is where chapter 14 ends. And in the next chapter, chapter 15, titled The Wonders of the Last Sea, the Dawn Treader will travel through the last sea.
You're getting really good at these really short summaries.
Oh, don't you like them? So before we go, we do have some listener feedback that I'm going to read here. And this email is from a listener named Jenny. Hi, Daniel and Phil. I recently discovered your Narnia podcast and have been quickly making my way through the episodes. Thank you for making a fun and meaningful podcast that allows me to spend more time in Narnia. I recently finished the first season, and I already know I will be sad when I catch up to where the show is currently. I really enjoyed the back and forth between Daniel, who frequently reads The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and with children, and Phil, who is reading it through for the first time in a long time. I also love hearing your guests' thoughts. I have to say, the podcast is making me think about Narnia in a deeper, more meaningful way. I especially loved hearing how Aslan's breath is like the Holy Spirit in the books. If that were the only thing I got from listening to your podcast, then it would be totally worth it. But I've gotten so much more. I also love when you had Daniel's wife Anna on, and she talked about the significance of having Lucy and Susan at the scene of the stone table in Aslan's resurrection, and how that mirrors the women in the Bible who were present at Christ's death and resurrection. So beautiful. Now, I can't read too much more because she goes on to talk a little bit about the horse and his boy, which would be a huge spoiler for both Phil and I. But I wanted to read one other thing from her email here.
This is why I'm not allowed to have access to the email.
She also writes this. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is my favorite of the Narnia books. I first read it when I was about 13 and remember being deeply moved by Aslan's sacrifice for Edmund and knowing this was a picture of Jesus' love and sacrifice for us. I also read Prince Caspian as an adolescent. But it wasn't until my now husband and I were dating/engaged long distance that I read through all the Narnia books with him, and we would discuss them and read aloud chapters over Skype. Now I am rereading them and enjoying them even more. I'm so glad I thought to look for a Narnia podcast. Further up and further in, Jenny.
That is such a cool way to read these books.
Over Skype?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Man, that's incredible.
I
so good.
picked this email specifically because she mentioned Aslan's breath being like the Holy Spirit. And a couple of chapters ago on the Dark Island, we had the albatross show up. And a couple of our listeners have also pointed out that albatross is kind of like the Holy Spirit too. You know, we've talked about, okay, we clearly have a Father, like God the Father in the Trinity. We obviously have the Son, but where does the Holy Spirit play out? You know, David Bates, when he was on the show a couple of seasons ago, talked about Aslan's breath. But then we also have this idea of the albatross as well, too. And I love these kind of different manifestations of what is that third part of the Trinity here in the Narnia Chronicles.
Yeah, that's really good.
Indeed.
All right, well, we are here at the end of this episode. I'm kind of sad that it's over. We've loved having you on, Justin.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, man. This has been great.
Indeed, it was an absolute honor. I appreciate what you guys do, and even you reading those letters from people who listen to your podcast just shows that you're having an impact, and you're keeping it fun. You know, it's life is serious enough, so when you have something like this podcast that you guys are doing about C.S. Lewis's writings, it's something fun for so many people, and so I really appreciate what you guys do, and I'll be glad to continue to promote your podcast.
Well, thank you, Justin.
I
We
really appreciate that. It's fun for me, especially because we've had David from Pints with Jack on our show. And right before that, I listened to the episode with Justin. And now I feel like this has kind of come full circle.
Yeah.
And we all got to hang out in November. So the community is really great. And we're glad that you're a part of it. And glad that you've been so welcoming, too.
Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed. I didn't know if you guys saw the comment on Facebook from David Bates when he said, when I tagged you guys in a post, and he said, not those guys.
We have a very fun relationship with the guys over at Pints with Jack.
We sure do.
They're wonderful. We love them.
Yes. indeed.
Well, yeah, this has been really fun. And for listeners, we will have some links if you want to check out Justin's work. They'll be in the episode's description. If you haven't already seen them after listening to this episode, you can find his book. We'll post it there and just find other ways for you to follow him and engage with him. Justin, you are one of the nicest guys that I've ever met. I wanted to tell this story real quick before we let you go, that when we met you, I don't think we'd ever engaged at all online. Like we knew who you were through stuff like with Pints with Jack, but I don't think we'd ever talked before, right?
Yes, I don't know if I was aware of your podcast.
No,
I think I
I don't
heard
think
of
so.
it, but yeah.
We were young,
And so
but you had a very distinct voice. As soon as I heard you speaking with someone, I thought that's the guy. It's a really good voice for podcasting. You're lucky.
But we met you at the symposium. We introduced ourselves to you. We kind of told you what we were up to. And you were one of the people who invited us to go hang out with Douglas Gresham. Even though you had just met us, we got to go watch a short film that same afternoon. You invited us to a little group of people watching that. And you're so invitational to people. And I really think you're one of probably the best networked Lewis lovers. I don't even know what the right terminology is, but it's just someone who loves Lewis and his work. You're so well networked because just of your great personality and your friendliness. And so I'm so thankful that you bring that to our little community and all the different people you know. And so we're just really thankful for you and for your work and for all you do for this community of people who love the work of Lewis.
Agreed.
Thank you. That's very kind. And again, it's an honor to be part of this community, and it was so great meeting you guys, and I love connecting people together and bringing community together, and it's amazing what happens. This is evidence of it, and we promote each other's work, whether it be a podcast or a particular book or a song or a film or a business. It's a really great community to be a part of. So I really appreciate your guys' kind words, and it is an honor to call you both friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you, sir. You're very kind. So I think that's a great way for us to end the show, right?
I think so.
Yes, indeed.
Well, Phil, do you want to take it away with the ending here?
I sure do. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Madeline Heising, Hannah Anderson, and John Marr for supporting us at the Care Paravel level. Follow us into Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages, and if you have any feedback, you can also email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. A review on Apple Podcasts would also be appreciated. Helps other people find the show and enjoying our read-through. Also, make sure you have subscribed in your favorite podcast app so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back next time with Chapter 15.